I don't know that any parts of it are actually possible. Certainly not in the near term. In terms of broad appeal, there is some political gain in beating up big technology companies. We've known that. There is a strain out there that is willing to say that all things big are bad, and there's a political constituency for that. I don't think it's broadly shared. Certainly not by the customers of these companies, who are all pretty fairly well satisfied with their customer experience with nearly all of the large tech companies.
And, Warren talks about how, look, the government went after Microsoft, and that led the way for the growth of today's technology giants. If we go after them, that will lead the way for the next group. But as we know, Google came about on its own. Microsoft bungled online. Microsoft bungled mobile. So do we really need some kind of help with the next generation of innovators, or will that process happen organically in a way because of the monopolistic behavior of the tech giants today?
I mean, I think history has shown that in general, competition in the tech field happens because of big shifts that the giants of the day miss rather than antitrust regulation. I think what's interesting in the Microsoft example, and I do think Elizabeth Warren misses the point on a couple of fronts, is I would argue that the antitrust scrutiny did slow Microsoft's innovation, not so much because of the rules that were imposed, but because Microsoft as a company became more worried about regulation and less aggressive, and then other companies were able to do things that weren't. For example, bundling the browser and the operating system, which was the crux of the Microsoft antitrust case. If you look today's platforms that rival Windows, Apple certainly bundles a browser, so does on both the Mac and the iPhone, so does Google on the Chromebook. So I think antitrust regulation can have its place, but as we write in a piece today, it's often in a different way than regulators actually intend.
Tony, one of the things that Ben Thompson of Stratechery talks about is that perhaps the biggest regulatory failure of the past decade was regulators allowing Facebook to acquire Instagram. So, since that's already the case, he would say he has qualms about them going back and undoing it and the kind of precedent that would set. But should there be more action taken to address that issue? Is it enough to just say, well, you can't continue to buy other social networks?
Yeah, it's hard to see why. I mean, I know you use the phrase of them acting like monopolies. We haven't actually seen them acting like monopolies, and the acquisition of Instagram is actually a perfect example. If they had acquired Instagram, shut it down, took the technology, and just plugged it into Facebook to acquire those customers, that would have been monopolistic. Instead, what they did is they took a company that had, I think, a tenth of the number of participants now on Instagram, and not a clear idea of how to make money on that platform, and they made it highly profitable with lots of activity and 1 billion participants now. So that's not acting like a monopoly, and they had other reasons for why they're doing it. I understand why people are reticent about this. We're just not seeing the evidence that consumers are being harmed, and in fact, consumers continue to be much happier with their experience.
Right, and in the U.S., that consumer harm, obviously is the core of antitrust. It's not like the EU where it's, you could say it's pro-competitive. So just finally, one of the issues, and we've talked about this before, but the dearth of local newspapers, the demise of local journalism, and the inability of anyone to make a living by gaining ads because of Facebook and Google is a real problem. So, Ina, how would you, if you're a regulator, if you're running for president, say we're going to tackle the advertising industry, would you have to force them to, sort of spread the money around? Or how would you really get to that core problem, which even just overnight, again, we've heard from News Corp complaining about?
Well, I mean, you identify a very real problem, which is, in the analog era, a lot of the ad dollars went to journalism organizations. And one could certainly argue, as a journalist, I would argue, that's great for democracy. And now you have most of the ad dollars going to Google and Facebook. And as you point out, that's not so good for journalism. But there's not a clear answer to that. You've identified the problem, but there isn't a clear answer. And I don't think antitrust regulation really helps with that problem at all.